Hi, welcome back. We're going to do another video on our first enemy. In our first video, we set it up so our enemy moves. And the movement that we've created is that when our character gets too close to the enemy, then the enemy starts chasing the character. We also set up some animations so that when it's moving, it plays a walking animation. When it's not moving, it just plays the idle animation. But we don't have any kind of system in place where our character can actually attack and defeat the enemy, right? If I shoot an arrow at this beetle, it just goes right through. If I try to use my shovel attack, nothing happens, right? So we want to create a system so that when our enemy gets hit by any kind of attack, it can destroy the enemy. Now, if we go to the event sheet, what we have so far is a bunch of groups for all of our character stuff, and then we have all these different events that we made last time for the enemy movement. Now, what I would recommend doing is making a group for all the enemy stuff now. If I right-click down here on the bottom, white space, I can click on Add Group. And if you add a group, let's call this one, I'm going to call it Enemy 1. And what I can do is I can drag all of these individual events, drop them down to where it says Add Event, to Enemy 1, and that way they're grouped under that category. Now what you can actually do is you can do subgroups too, which is kind of handy. Let me show you what that is. If I right click up on the top where it says Enemy 1, I can click on Add Subgroup and say I call this one Enemy 1 Movement. And what I can do is I can take all these movement parts and put it in there. So you can actually have like separate groups within the major group for each individual part, which is a nice way of organizing things. It comes in handy later on. So I recommend maybe at least use this main group, but you can do subgroups too if you want. But anyway, that's all organizational stuff. Let's add an event and let's talk about how we can destroy our enemy with an attack. Let's go to Add Event, and we're going to go to the enemy. And if we scroll down just a little bit, there's a whole section on collisions. We're going to use this one. It says on collision with another object. A collision is when two things hit each other. Now there are other things here too, which maybe we'll talk about later, but this is the one that we want to use for now. On collision with another object. We're going to click to choose what object we want to work with here. We can use either one of these for now. Let's use the attack hitbox. I think that one's a little bit trickier, so maybe that's a good place to start. Let's go with the attack hitbox. Now, if you don't remember what the attack hitbox is, it's under the character attack group. It's a small square that gets spawned as your character attacks. And right now it's set to invisible, but if you want, and let me just do this so I can show you what it looks like. If I make it visible by double clicking there and I press play, when I do, in my case, like this digging animation, see those green squares that pop up? Those are attack hitboxes. And what we can do is we can make it so whenever one of these attack hitboxes collides with our enemy, then we can make the enemy lose life or be stunned or be destroyed. So let's go back down to this section here. And we're saying that when the enemy collides with the attack hitbox, we can add an action. And let's do something very simple to start with. We're going to say for our enemy, when it collides with the attack hitbox, it can be destroyed. We can just click on destroy. And that makes it so whenever it gets hit, it just instantly disappears. Now, let's test to see if that works. It's not going to feel very rewarding, but if I hit it, it's gone, right? Because it collided with one of these green boxes that I created, the attack hitbox. And that works, but it doesn't feel very satisfying because it just disappears. So let's talk about how we can make that a little bit more interesting. And there's a couple ways we can do it. For one, we can give our enemy life points, like hit points or health, so that it takes more than one hit to destroy our enemy. We can also make it so that when our enemy gets hit, it knocks them back a little bit. And maybe even does something like we can have it play an animation to show that our enemy's been hurt. Or maybe in our case, since we don't have an animation ready, we can make it so that it flashes for a second so that our player knows that the enemy has taken damage. We have all kinds of things we can do with that. We're going to start by giving our enemy life. Right now, it doesn't have any hit points. It just, as soon as it gets hit, it's destroyed. What we want to do is we want to give it an instance variable that represents how much life our enemy has. So let's click on layout. Let's make sure our enemy is selected. And I'm going to go over to the left where it says instance variables. Now let's click on that. And let's add a new instance variable. This is going to be a number that represents how much life our enemy has. So we could call it life, or you could call it health, or hit points, whatever terminology you like to use. I'm going to call it life. And the initial value is how much life your enemy has, how many times your player has to hit the enemy before the enemy is defeated. Now, I recommend starting with a relatively small number like 3. Don't make it a big number yet because you're going to have to test it out a couple times, and it'll be annoying to have to keep hitting your enemy to test it. So let's just make it 3 for now. We can always change that later. And click OK. Now we can close that window. And let's go back to our event sheet. We're going to get rid of this destroy part. We can right-click on it, delete it. Let's get rid of that. And instead, let's add an action for our enemy. And if I scroll down, you'll see the option for subtract from. If I click on that, what we can do is we can subtract 1 from our life number. So if we hit it once, it'll go down to 2. If we hit it another time, it'll go down to 1. And if we hit it a third time, it'll be at 0, right? Now, you can also have any number here for the value. Like say, for example, you have different types of attacks, and maybe some attacks are stronger than others. So maybe some of the attacks, the value might be 2, so it hits it for 2 life points. Or maybe some of them might be 5, so it hits the enemy for 5 points instead of just 1. You can play with that to make certain attacks stronger than others. But for this, let's keep it at 1. This is going to be a 1 value attack. Great. So every time it gets hit with an attack hitbox, it subtracts 1 life. Now the next thing we have to do is we have to add an event for the enemy. And we're going to go down to compare instance variable. Now what this is it's going to track to see when the life is equal to 0. So it says life, comparison, 0. Now, I'm going to recommend that you change the equal to less or equal. And the reason why I'm doing that is because say you do have an attack that does more than just 1 point of damage. Say an attack that does 10 points of damage, but our enemy only has 3 life points. If you were to hit it with that 10-point attack, it wouldn't stop at 0. Its life total will go all the way into the negative numbers, and it would be -7. And since it's not equal to 0, it wouldn't die. So you have to have less or equal, just in case you dip below the 0 mark when you attack it. So life, less or equal, 0. Good. When the life does hit 0, we're going to add an action to our enemy, and now we can destroy it. Now let's try that out and see what happens. It's not going to really work yet, and I'll show you why. When I go up, I should have to hit it 3 times, right? But if I hit it once, it's automatically destroyed. The reason for that is because look at how many hitboxes I'm making. I'm making a bunch of hitboxes, and each one of those hitboxes is doing 1 damage to our enemy. So it's like instantly hitting it for, in this case, probably like 6 hitboxes. And that's not the way we want it to happen. There's a couple things we can do about that. I'm going to show you one thing that I think is a good recommendation, and that's back in the attack section. If I go back to my attack group, right now it's set up so that all of my attack hitboxes stay there until the animation is finished, which is fine. But if you really want to make it more, if you want to make the hitboxes a little bit more responsive and a little bit more like true to the animation, we can add another event here. And what I'm going to do is go to my attack hitbox, and I'm going to go down to on created. So as soon as it's created, we're going to add another action. This time we're going to go to our system, and we're going to go down to something called wait. What wait does is it waits a certain amount of time before the next action happens. So for example, I can set this to a really small number, like 0.1. 0.1 seconds, just like a split second. If I click done, and then I add an action below that, attack, destroy, as soon as our attack boxes are created, after 0.1 seconds, they'll be destroyed. Let's take a look at how that looks. See how they're like faster now? They don't just sit on the screen, but instead they like are only there for a split second. I think that's helpful. Now, we can always mess around with that later. You can always adjust this number to make it really kind of fine-tuned to the way you want your attacks to be. But I think that's a good idea. Now, it's still not going to help us out of the problem that we're in now, though. If I go up to it and hit it, still going to die. Because even though those boxes are disappearing in a half a second or even less, 0.1 seconds, there's still a lot of hitboxes happening, right? So what we want to do is we want to make it so that when our enemy gets hit, then it'll be invincible for a short amount of time. So it can only be hit by one hitbox before it's invulnerable for maybe a second or half a second. So what we can do for that is we can add another instance variable, right? We have an instance variable for life. Now let's add another instance variable. And this one is going to represent when it's invincible. I'm going to call it invincible. You can use a different word if you want. It's going to represent when it can't take damage. So a word like invulnerable or invincible or something like that, I think is a fitting name. And the type for this is going to be a Boolean. Now remember, Boolean is true or false, right? So this is basically going to say, is it invincible true or is it invincible false? Good. Now let's add an action. We're adding an action for this event. Right when it gets hit by the attack hitbox, it subtracts 1 life, and then we're going to go to our enemy, and we're going to set the Boolean for invincible to true. So right after it takes damage, it's invincible. Now we don't want to stay invincible forever, right? Just for a short amount of time. So let's add another action. And this time we're going to go to the system, and we're going to use that same wait that we used just a minute ago. All the way down at the bottom, you'll find wait. Double click on that, and we're going to decide how long we want our enemy to be invincible. Let's start with 0.5, half a second. It'll be invincible for half a second. We can always change that to make it longer or shorter later, but I think half a second is good. And then after half a second, we want the invincible to turn to false. So we're going to add an action, go to our enemy, scroll down to set Boolean, invincible, false. So now when it's hit, we subtract 1 from its life total, it turns invincible, and then half a second later, it turns invincible off. Now the last thing that we have to do to make this work is we want to tell it that the enemy can only collide with an attack hitbox if it's not invincible, right? If invincible is false. So I can do that by adding another condition. You can add another condition by double-clicking over here on the left tab. You can also double-click in the gray area down below. And we're going to go to enemy, and we're going to scroll down to is Boolean instance variable set. Double-click on that, and it's set to invincible. Good. Now technically this is wrong because it's saying that when the enemy collides with an attack hitbox, if it is invincible, then it takes damage. That's the opposite of what we want, right? We want it to only take damage if it's not invincible. So what we can do, and this is something we talked about in the last video, we can right click on where it says is invincible and we can hit invert. What that does is it changes it to the opposite. Now, instead of it saying when it is invincible, it's saying when it's not invincible. So now, as long as it's not invincible, it'll take 1 life off its total. If it is invincible for that half a second, it won't. And that should work. Let's try it out. I'm going to go up to my enemy. I'm going to hit him once. I'm going to hit him twice. I'm going to hit him 3 times, and he's gone. Perfect. Now, the only thing I would say for that is it doesn't feel like I'm hitting him still. You know, I can tell that I am. I have my hitboxes visible, so I can see that I'm hitting him. But for the player, there's nothing to really show them that the enemy is taking damage, right? There's a bunch of things we could do for this. There's a whole variety of ways that you can communicate to the player that the enemy is taking damage. You could make an animation for it. You could have numbers pop up on the screen that says like -1 or whatever. What we're going to do is we're going to make our enemy flash for a second. And we're also going to make our enemy get pushed back a little bit. We call that knockback. Knockback is when something gets knocked back when you attack it. But let's start by just making our enemy flash. That's a simple thing. And I think it does help kind of communicate to the player that the enemy is damaged. To do it, we have to go to our layout and we want to make sure that our enemy is selected. And we're going to add another behavior to our enemy. I'm going to click on where it says behaviors on the left. I'm going to add a new behavior. And if you look on the left side, you should see a lightning bolt that says flash. Double click on that. Now our enemy has the flash behavior. And if I go to my event sheet, I can add another action to make it flash. Let's add the action to this first event. So when it gets hit, add action to enemy. And to scroll down a little bit, you'll find flash. Double click on that. Now for flash, the on time and the off time are how fast it flashes, and the duration is how long it flashes for. So what I'd recommend doing is keeping it kind of short. We're doing 0.5 seconds for the invincible, so we can have that be the same number. So as long as it's invincible, it'll be flashing 0.5. Good. Now the last thing we have to be careful of here is that anything that's after this wait 0.5 seconds won't happen right away. It'll happen after the 0.5 seconds is up. So we want to pay attention to where things are in the order of our actions. And we want the flash to start happening at the beginning, right? Rather than waiting until the end. So I would move the flash up above the system wait. Let's try that out. Now when I hit the enemy, they should flash. Cool. See how they flash for half a second? Perfect. The last thing I think that we're going to add is knockback. We're going to make it so that when our enemy gets hit, it pushes them back a little bit. And there's a bunch of ways we could do that. I'm going to show you one way, but this is not the only way. It's a way that I think is relatively easy and it works pretty well. But there are a bunch of other alternative methods for this as well. What we're going to use is another behavior. If you go to your layout, make sure that the enemy is selected, and we're going to click on behaviors again. We're going to add a new behavior, and what we're going to use is down towards the bottom, 8-direction movement. We've used 8-direction movement before. We used it for our main character to make them move around the screen, right? But this time we're going to use it on our enemy to push them back whenever they get hit. Now, one thing I'd point out is that after you add that behavior, you'll see the 8-direction section down here. Right away, you want to turn off default controls. What default controls are is that it sets the keyboard arrow keys to control that object. So if you leave that box checked, your player can actually move the enemy around with the arrow keys. And you don't want that, right? So we're going to uncheck that box. Let's also we're going to add an instance variable too while we're here. If you go to instance variable, what we're going to do is we're going to add one called knockback. You can call it something else, but I think knockback is a good description. And this is going to be a Boolean. So it's going to check to see if our enemy is being knocked back or if it's not. Click OK. So we have life, we have invincible, we have knockback. Perfect. Let's go to our event sheet. What we're going to do is we're going to set the knockback to true when it gets hit. And then after the 0.5 seconds is up, we're going to set the knockback to false. So I'm going to add an action to this first event. I'm going to go to my enemy. I'm going to scroll down to set Boolean. I'm going to have invincible true. Oh, I'm sorry, not invincible. Knockback. Now I'm going to take that knockback true and I'm going to drag it up above the wait. And then I'm going to add an action to the enemy, set Boolean, knockback, false. So just like with the invincible turns true and the knockback turns true as soon as it gets hit. And then half a second later, the invincible turns off and the knockback turns off as well. Cool. Now let's add another event. And for this event, we're going to take our enemy. We're going to go down to is Boolean instance variable set. Double click on that. And we're going to test to see if knockback is true. Click done. If the knockback is true, then what we're going to use is the 8-direction movement to push our enemy back just for a little bit. So let's add an action, go to enemy 1, And right at the top, you'll see the section for a direction. We're going to use for this, we could use a couple things. I think set vector is probably the easiest. What set vector X does is it just pushes something in the X direction, in the left and right direction. So we can do set X vector, and we can set this number to whatever we want. The higher the number, the more intense the knockback is. So we're going to mess around with some numbers and see what feels good. I'm going to start with 500, and we'll see how that is. Let's try it. It's maybe not going to work well yet, but we can at least see if it works at all. See how it kind of gets knocked back a little bit? It's just a little bit. Now, if yours doesn't, it might be because you're hitting it from a different direction. As it is right now, you have to hit the enemy from this side in order for the knockback to happen. If you hit it from the other side, it might not do anything. We're going to have to fix that. So you can see on mine, it doesn't get knocked back from that direction, but it does from this direction. Cool. So there's two things I want to fix here. I want to make it so it gets knocked back from either direction, and I want to maybe adjust the numbers a little bit so the knockback feels a little bit more intense. If you want to change the amount of knockback that happens, what you can do is change this number. We can make it 1,000. And let's see how that feels. Good. It's a little bit more intense. There's other numbers we can change too. See where it says 8 direction on the left menu here? These numbers will all affect the impact too. If you make the max speed higher here, it'll go a little bit further. So let's say we make this one 500. Now that should push it back a little bit more. That's maybe too much, right? He pushes him so far away, he's not even in the line of sight. So maybe 500 is too much. So let's turn that down to 100. And that's not enough. He barely gets pushed back at all. So you have to kind of fine tune it and see what works. You can also change the acceleration. The acceleration is how fast it'll go up to full speed. Deceleration is how long it takes to slow down to a stop. So we have to kind of just mess around with these and find a setting that works good for you. I wish I could just tell you the right numbers to put in, but it really depends on how big your sprites are and how you want the attack to feel. So you have to kind of feel it out for yourself. I'll show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to have the vector X set to 1,000. I'm going to have the max speed set to like 500. And I'm going to turn the deceleration up. I'm going to turn that up to, I'm going to try, let's say, I'm going to try 1,000. So that it'll be pushed back pretty hard, but it'll decelerate pretty fast. So that seems pretty good. It's maybe too much. So maybe I'll make the max speed 400 instead. Let's see how that feels. That seems good. Cool. Now, if yours isn't working at all, again, the reason for that is because you might not be hitting it from the right side, right? If I try to hit it over here, nothing happens. I have to be hitting it from over here. So let's fix that. The way that we can fix that is we're going to have to check to see which direction our player is hitting the enemy from. And to do that, we're going to use something that we talked about in the last video. I'm going to add another condition to this knockback part. If I right click over here on the left side, I'm going to go to my enemy and I'm going to hit compare X. Do you guys remember the compare X thing? It's a way of testing to see where the enemy is on the screen compared to our player. So right now it's going to say equal. Let's change that to greater than. So we're going to say if our enemy's X coordinate is greater than our main character's X coordinate. And to do that, I have to type in the name of my main character. Now, if you don't remember the name of your main character, it's probably over here. So you can just kind of check over here on the right side. But you want to type in their name and then period, and then the letter X. So what we have is our enemy's X is greater than our main character's X. Click done. And we're also going to have to do the same thing for when our enemy's X is less than our main character's X. So let's try going to add event. Let's go to the enemy. Let's go to is Boolean instance variable set knockback. So we have the same thing. And this time we're going to add another variable, enemy, compare X. And this time instead of greater than, we're going to go less than. And just like the last time, we're going to type in the name of our main character, period X. And click done. Now from here, we're going to add an action. We're going to go to our enemy. We're going to set vector X. But in this case, instead of pushing it 1,000 pixels, let's try doing it negative 1,000. Whatever number you put for the first one when it was facing this direction, we're going to put the opposite for when it's facing the other direction. So just put a negative in front of the number. And let's see if that works. I'm going to go over here to the other side. I'm going to hit my enemy. Oh, it flips him upside down. That's interesting, huh? The reason why it flips him upside down is because there's one last setting that we have to fix on our behavior. If I go over to the layout, I want to make sure that my enemy is clicked on, and you'll see the 8 direction behavior over here. See where it says set angle? We want to turn that to no. What the set angle does is it tries to guess which direction you want to rotate the character based on how they're moving. And in some cases that might work out well, but in our situation it doesn't. So we want to set the angle to no. Now when I try it, I'm going to hit him from the right. Good, it pushes him back. Hit him from the left, pushes him back. Hit him a third time, he dies. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my character attack part, and I've turned my attack hitboxes visible just so we could test it, right? But now I want to go back and I want to make those invisible because ultimately the player shouldn't see the hitboxes. So if I turn those invisible, you can't see them. It just looks like I'm digging, right? So I dig, I hit him, I dig and hit him, dig and hit him again, destroys him. We should add some kind of death animation there. You know, some kind of skull pops up or, you know, maybe a little explosion or something to really show that they've been defeated. But we can add that in a little bit later. Now, I would maybe add a group for this. Now, we added a subgroup for the enemy movement. We can add a subgroup. If I click up here on the enemy one, I can hit add subgroup, and I can call this one enemy one damage. You can call it whatever you want, but I think that I know what that means. And I'm going to add the stuff I just made into that section. So now we have a group for the movement, and we have a group for the damage. Now you might be saying, okay, but what about the projectile? What about the arrow, right? If we hit our enemy with an arrow, it should do the same thing, right? It should hit them and take away life and maybe even knock them back. You can take this stuff and you can copy and paste it, and all you have to change is just this section to make it work for the arrow as well. So let me show you how to do that, and then we'll leave it there for today. If you right-click on this section, you want to make sure that you have the whole thing selected by kind of clicking over here on the left tab. But you can hit copy, right-click over here again, and hit paste. Now we have that whole section again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double-click here where it says on collision with attack. And I'm going to change the object to arrow. Now if you click done and press play, all that stuff will work for the projectile attack too. And you can make adjustments to it. Like the knockback seems a little extreme for the arrow there, but it works. The last thing I'm going to add, sorry, I keep adding more stuff. Notice how when I hit the enemy with the arrow, how the arrow keeps going. That's kind of weird. I feel like the arrow should hit the beetle and stop. So I'm going to add that in really quick. All you have to do for that is add an action when the enemy and the arrow collide to the arrow. And I'm going to go to destroy. So that way, when the enemy and the arrow collide, the arrow gets destroyed. And you probably want to drag that up before the wait, right? You don't want to wait half a second before it gets destroyed. And that way, as soon as it gets hit, it destroys the arrow. That's pretty good. There it goes. All right, that was a lot of stuff, but it works pretty well. Next video, we'll add an attack for the enemy so that our enemy can attack our player at the same time that our player is attacking our enemy. Thank you.